Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Monday, July 27th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. In Riverside, we're looking at a warm day with a high of 94.5 degrees and a low of 71.6. It is going to be quite hot out there, so please remember to stay hydrated and keep cool if you are spending any time outside today. On today's program, we are digging into the legal reasoning behind a court decision that blocked an executive order concerning voter lists. We will also examine the situation regarding Ken Paxton and the serious allegations of voter fraud that have been leveled against him. Along with these topics, we will cover a variety of other stories impacting the nation. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. Good morning, everyone. We're following a major court ruling on voting rules that could shape November's elections. Ethan, what did the court decide?
Good morning, Grace. On Saturday, July 25th, just 2 days ago, the First U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld a lower court's injunction. That ruling blocks an executive order President Donald Trump signed back in March. Essentially, the administration can't create a federal voter list or impose new mail-in voting restrictions in the affected areas. The court affirmed that the order was unconstitutional.
Let's back up. What exactly did that executive order call for?
Sure. Trump signed it on March 31st this year, aiming to give the federal government more control over state election processes. According to CBS News, Fox 5 DC, and the Associated Press, the order required officials to build what it called a state citizenship list. That would be a roster of eligible voters, citizens living in each state who'd be at least 18 by the next federal election. Then that list was supposed to go out to the states.
And who is tasked with actually creating this list?
That's where it gets a little tricky. The order named the Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services and the Commissioner of the Social Security Administration, but Fox 5 DC described it slightly differently, saying the Homeland Security Secretary would work with the Social Security Administration. Either way, the point was to have federal agencies compile who's eligible to vote and hand that to the states.
So how did the mail-in ballots fit into all of this?
This is the part that alarmed a lot of election officials. The U.S. Postal Service was ordered to deliver mail-in ballots exclusively to people whose names appeared on that federal list. In other words, if you weren't on it, you wouldn't get a ballot in the mail. The order also included other requirements that weren't fully specified. Critics say that alone could have disenfranchised eligible voters who somehow got left off.
How did the president defend the order publicly?
Trump framed it as a safeguard against non-U.S. citizens voting. Speaking in the Oval Office, he said, quote, "The cheating on mail-in voting is legendary," end quote. That's been a consistent theme for him for years now. Supporters argue it's about election integrity, but independent studies have repeatedly found that voter fraud, especially by non-citizens, is extremely rare in American elections.
So who pushed back, and where did the legal fight begin?
Democratic officials from the District of Columbia and 23 states filed a lawsuit. They brought it in the U.S. District Court in Boston, arguing the order was flatly unconstitutional. Their core claim was about who actually controls elections in this country. They said the authority to set election rules belongs to Congress and the states, not to the president acting alone.
That's a big constitutional argument. Did they raise practical concerns too?
They did, and those may resonate with everyday voters. State election officials argued the mandates were, quote, ripe for abuse, end quote. They warned it could cause widespread chaos on the ground. Imagine trying to reconcile a federal list with state voter rolls just months before an election. Officials feared errors, delays, and confusion at exactly the wrong moment.
Who heard the case first, and how did that judge rule?
The case went before U.S. District Court Judge Indira Talwani, who was appointed by President Barack Obama. She sided with the plaintiffs and issued an initial injunction back in June. That order halted the implementation of the executive order for the November 3rd elections, but only within the jurisdictions that sued. So it was a significant early win for those states and D.C.
And then the appeals court weighed in this weekend?
Right. On July 25th, the first U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals backed Judge Talwani's ruling. Fox 5 DC reported that the appellate court affirmed the finding that the executive order was unconstitutional. So now we have two levels of federal courts agreeing on the same point. That makes it a much stronger legal position heading into the fall.
Let's talk about reach. Exactly where does this injunction apply?
It covers the District of Columbia plus 23 states. Those are Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, North Carolina, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, and Wisconsin. I should note there's a small discrepancy in the reporting. Fox 5 DC's detailed list actually identified 22 states rather than 23.
Any sense of why that count doesn't quite match?
It's not entirely clear from the coverage. It could simply be a difference in how outlets tallied the plaintiffs. What matters for listeners is that a large, coordinated group of Democratic-led states and the district joined this challenge. And in all of those places, the executive order can't take effect for the November election while this ruling stands.
What about the states that didn't join the lawsuit?
That's an important question. This injunction only protects the jurisdictions that actually sued. States that stayed out of the case aren't directly covered by this particular ruling. So there's a patchwork element here, which is part of why election law fights can get so complicated. Different rules could theoretically apply in different places, depending on who challenged what.
How has the administration responded to losing at the appeals level?
Initially, on Sunday, both the White House and the Justice Department didn't respond to inquiries. But the Justice Department later gave a statement to the Associated Press. They said they're, quote, reviewing all options, end quote, when it comes to their next legal steps. And they made clear they still believe the executive order will ultimately be upheld.
So this may not be over. What could the next steps look like?
Right, this ruling likely isn't the final word. The Justice Department could ask the full appeals court to reconsider, or it could try to take the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. Given how high the stakes are for election rules, many legal observers expect the administration to keep fighting. But time matters here, because the November 3rd elections are getting closer every week.
With the calendar tightening, how significant is the timing of all this?
It's really significant. We're talking about roughly 3 months until those November elections. Courts generally try to avoid changing election rules too close to voting to prevent confusion. So the fact that two courts have now blocked the order gives states some stability as they prepare. Election administrators can plan mail-in voting the way they normally would, at least in the covered jurisdictions.
Big picture, why does this case matter beyond this one election?
At its heart, this is a fight over who controls American elections. The Constitution has long given that power primarily to the states and to Congress, not the president. So a ruling like this reinforces those boundaries. However this ends, it could set an important precedent about how much a president can reshape voting procedures through executive action alone.
That's a lot to watch in the months ahead. Ethan, thank you for breaking it down so clearly.
My pleasure, Grace. I'll keep tracking whether the Justice Department appeals, and we'll bring folks any updates as they come.
That was reporter Ethan with the latest on that voting rights ruling. Stay with us because we've got another important story coming up right after this. Welcome back. Now to a story out of Texas that's putting the state's top lawyer under a harsh spotlight. Attorney General Ken Paxton, who's running for the U.S. Senate, is facing accusations of voter fraud. For more, we're joined by our reporter Chloe. Chloe, good morning.
Good morning, Grace. This one's really striking because of the irony. Ken Paxton has spent years positioning himself as a crusader against voter fraud in Texas. And now, according to reporting from ProPublica and the Texas Tribune, he's the one being accused of doing exactly that. It's the kind of story that immediately grabs attention here.
So walk us through it. What exactly is he accused of doing?
According to ProPublica and the Texas Tribune, Paxton allegedly voted illegally in 6 consecutive elections. The claim is that he used an address where he no longer actually lived. The reports say he moved out of the home he shared with his wife, State Senator Angela Paxton, back in 2024. But he kept casting ballots using that same residence anyway.
And that includes a pretty important race, right?
It does. This pattern allegedly included the March Republican primary. That's the same primary where Paxton defeated Senator John Cornyn, whose Senate seat he's now trying to win. So we're not talking about some minor local election. These are high-stakes contests, and the timing makes the allegations far more politically explosive than they'd otherwise be.
Who's been pushing these claims into public view?
The Democratic candidate for that Senate seat, State Representative James Tallarico, has been amplifying them. At a campaign event in Houston, Tallarico alleged that Paxton committed voter fraud by voting from the wrong address. There's also reporting from an outlet called Joe Magad, which suggests Paxton allegedly voted several times in the district of his mistress. Meanwhile, his voter registration stayed tied to the home of his estranged wife.
That's a remarkable detail. But is any of this actually illegal under Texas law?
That's the key question, and it's not totally clear-cut. 3 election experts consulted by ProPublica and the Texas Tribune said Paxton's actions may have violated state law. Now, Texas law does allow voters to temporarily use a non-residential address, but only if they intend to return to that home. The problem, according to those election lawyers, is that such a defense is unlikely to hold up given Paxton's, quote, ongoing public and acrimonious divorce, end quote.
So his own divorce could undercut his legal defense.
Exactly. If you're publicly and bitterly separating from your spouse, it's hard to argue you intend to return to the marital home. That's the crux of why the experts think a temporary address defense would struggle. It essentially turns his personal life into legal evidence. And that's an uncomfortable position for someone whose entire brand has been about election integrity.
How are political observers reading all this?
Cal Jilson, a political science professor at Southern Methodist University, offered some useful perspective. He noted these allegations may really resonate with voters because they reinforce a long-standing narrative. That narrative is that Paxton uses his office for personal gain. Jilson pointed to Paxton's history, and he described this voting controversy as another example of the Attorney General, quote, playing fast and loose, end quote, with the very laws he's supposed to uphold.
You mentioned his history. What's he referring to there?
Jilson pointed out that bribery and corruption charges were central to the Texas legislature's 2023 impeachment of Paxton. That impeachment was a major moment in Texas politics. Now, it's important to be fair here. The state Senate later acquitted him, so he wasn't removed from office. But the memory of that whole episode lingers, and this new controversy taps right back into it.
So how has Paxton himself responded to the voter fraud questions?
Mostly by avoiding them, honestly. He held a news conference to tout endorsements from nearly 24 sheriffs. At that event, he attacked Tallarico as being, quote, soft on crime, end quote. But when a writer from the Dallas Morning News asked him directly why he voted in Collin County, Paxton just shook his head and declined to answer. A campaign aide then jumped in and said the office would only take law enforcement questions that day.
So he simply wouldn't engage on it.
Right, and that pattern has been consistent. Paxton's office and his campaign have similarly ignored inquiries from ProPublica and the Texas Tribune. So across multiple outlets and multiple opportunities, there's been no substantive answer. That silence itself has become part of the story because critics argue it speaks volumes, given how vocal he's been about election fraud in the past.
And what about Tallarico? How's he handling the soft-on-crime attack?
Tallarico pushed back with his own news conference to deny the charge. He cited his record in the legislature, specifically pointing out that he voted for billions of dollars in law enforcement funding. So he's essentially trying to neutralize the attack while keeping the focus on Paxton's alleged voting problems. It's a classic campaign counterpunch, and it shows how quickly this has become the central fight in the Senate race.
Let's talk about the formal side. Is anyone actually investigating this?
There is a formal complaint. The Collin County Democratic Party has filed one with the Texas Secretary of State's office, urging an investigation into Paxton for election fraud. And here's an important piece of process. Under state law, the Secretary of State is required to promptly refer such complaints to the Attorney General if there's reasonable cause to suspect criminal conduct.
Wait, refer it to the Attorney General? Isn't that Paxton's own office?
You've spotted the awkward part immediately, Grace. Yes, the complaint against Paxton could end up being referred to the office that Paxton himself runs. That built-in conflict is a big reason critics are skeptical anything will move quickly. It's one of those structural quirks that suddenly matters enormously when the person under scrutiny is the state's top legal officer.
And I understand there was also a shakeup at the Secretary of State's office.
There was, and the timing is notable. Former Secretary Jane Nelson left office on a Friday just 3 days after the complaint was filed. She was replaced by Robert Howden, who had been Governor Greg Abbott's senior advisor. Now, the office continues to decline reporters, questions, but Mary Higbee, the vice chair of the Collin County Democratic Party, said in an email that the complaint remains under review by a staff attorney.
So it's still technically alive? Just moving slowly?
That seems to be the state of things. We know it's under review, but there's very little transparency beyond that. The Attorney General's office hasn't confirmed whether it's even received the complaint. It also won't say whether it intends to hire a special prosecutor to investigate. So there are a lot of open questions and not many answers as of today, July 27th, 2026.
How are experts interpreting that lack of movement?
John Taylor, a political science professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio, was blunt about it. He argued the silence from the Republican-led state government suggests an attempt to, quote, slow walk, end quote, the investigation. Taylor described the whole situation as, quote, rank hypocrisy, end quote. His point was the contradiction between the government's tough rhetoric on securing Texas elections and its apparent lack of interest in pursuing these specific allegations.
So the criticism is really about consistency.
Exactly. The argument from Taylor and others is that if you campaign relentlessly on election integrity, you should apply that same standard to your own side. Instead, critics say, there's a striking quietness when the accused is the state's chief law enforcement officer. Whether that's fair or not, it's a powerful line of attack heading deeper into this Senate campaign.
Before we go, what should folks be watching for next?
I'd watch 2 things closely. First, whether the Secretary of State's office actually refers the complaint to the Attorney General, and how that conflict gets handled. Second, whether Paxton ever breaks his silence and offers a direct explanation for voting in Collin County. Until then, expect Tallarico to keep hammering this, and expect the story to stay front and center in the race for John Cornyn's seat.
Really fascinating stuff, and a story clearly still unfolding. Chloe, thank you so much for breaking it all down for us this morning.
My pleasure, Grace. Happy to be here.
Here are some other headlines. Turning up the heat in Europe, a blaze in southwest France is really sparking some chaos. A gigantic wildfire in the Gironde region has burned 42,000 hectares, forcing the largest peacetime evacuation since World War II. Over 300,000 people have been displaced across France and Spain. While the city of Bordeaux is acting as a safe harbor, the commune of La Porge has been completely devastated. Captain Nicolas Braz says the fire is actually creating its own weather, forming a rare pyrocumulonimbus cloud. President Emmanuel Macron has called a crisis cabinet meeting for Monday, July 27th, as 2,500 firefighters, 1,500 military personnel, and nearly 1,200 police battle the flames. Finance Minister Roland Lescure says the local economy has taken a major hit, and the Tour de France had to shorten its final stage because security personnel were redeployed to fight the fires. In a bit of a vintage crime, police arrested one person for allegedly stealing 44 bottles of wine from an evacuated home. Talk about a sparkling getaway. Crossing the pond to Florida, health officials are spotting some red flags. Collier County has become the epicenter of a measles outbreak that saw 107 cases over 3 months, starting at Ave Maria University. It is a growing trend, as the total number of cases in the United States as of July 27, 2026, has already outpaced the entire year of 2025. In Washington, the battle for the Senate is heating up, and Democrats are trying to flip the script. They need to win 4 Republican seats to take control, especially with President Trump and a Republican vice president holding the tie-breaking vote. In Maine, Susan Collins is facing Troy Jackson, In Michigan, centrist Haley Stevens and progressive Abdul El Sayed are fighting for the Democratic nomination before facing Mike Rogers. Ohio is seeing a rematch between Sherrod Brown and John Husted, while Minnesota is eyeing a primary between Peggy Flanagan and Angie Craig, with former sportscaster Michelle Tafoya in the Republican mix. Meanwhile, John Ossoff remains the favorite in Georgia against Mike Collins. Finally, tragedy struck Berlin during the Christopher Street Day Pride Parade. A minivan ramming and stabbing attack in Tiergarten Park killed one woman and injured 29 people. The suspect, 21-year-old Abdul Balaut, is described as an Islamist radical. Chancellor Friedrich Merz vowed to defend the values of openness and diversity, while the far-right AfD is using the tragedy to push for a shift in migration policy. In response, the LGBTQ community held a vigil at the Brandenburg Gate to ensure the tragedy isn't exploited for political gain. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.8, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.